All right, welcome everybody. I'm Leslie and I've been helping with these Zoom things this year. Happy to help. It's actually easier to do this Zoom to Zoom rather than going through a live performance. We apologize for our technical glitches last month. The sound system and the computer system had a war with each other. Sorry. Oh well. We do record this. It does go onto our website, and those members of our board are excited to see how many views we have. They were talking about other authors and speakers who get great YouTube views. So be sure to come back to the Quimper Geological Society website and see our recordings. If I could ask a favor of everybody to use the chat to ask questions, and we will try to get questions to Vince. Scott is going to be our host for tonight or this afternoon, whatever time of day it is where you are. And we don't have any poll, but I think our speaker had a couple of questions he wanted to ask. So take it away, Vince.
Or actually, I'll start out here.
I'm sorry, Scott.
I am Scott Miner. I am, for those of you who don't know me, I am a retired research geologist who is on the QGS advisory board, and I'm a part-time resident of Port Townsend. Before I introduce our speaker, Vince, I would like to just make a couple of general announcements. This is the last QGS talk of the spring. Our next talk won't be until the fall. We haven't totally filled in our slate for the fall yet, but stay tuned for details that will be sent via email soon. In July, QGS will be rerunning a field trip that we ran, I think it was a year ago, called Walk to the Rocks. And this is a field trip that goes to Tenomous Rock and Peregrine Rocks, which is near Chimacum, south of Port Townsend. So check your email in June for an announcement and details on that field trip. To introduce Vince, Vince is a very accomplished and decorated career as a teacher, researcher, science advocate, and communicator, author, and executive. For details, you can see the bio in the talk announcement. He served for many years as director of the Geological Survey of Colorado, which is where I first got to know Vince. One of his strong interests is structural evolution of the Rockies, which is a subject also close to my heart. An excellent earlier version of the talk that we're going to hear today, which I had the pleasure to hear several years ago, prompted me to approach Vince about giving the latest version of the talk for QGS. So please join me in welcoming Vince on his talk on the global scramble for natural resources and its impact on America.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks, Michael, for the invitation. I've known both of you guys for a long time and had the greatest respect for you. And Michael, when you decided to move to Washington from Colorado, I was really disappointed that you wanted to retire there because I was hoping you'd continue to solve a lot of our puzzles that we have in Colorado. Welcome to my home in Wisconsin. I moved to Wisconsin about 6 years ago because of the altitude, and we're enjoying living here now. And through Zoom, I can talk to you in Washington, and really am delighted to do that. I want to start this with a quiz. And if you would give me your answers in the chat, they're just one-word answers, and there's no penalty for, you're not going to be humiliated or anything like that if you get the wrong answer. But I'd really appreciate if you would put your answer in the chat so I could kind of get a feel for it, because I got the answer to both of these questions wrong the first time that I saw it. And I'm just curious whether people out there in Washington who are a higher level of interest or know about that. So the first one's about population. And China has about 1.41 billion. India has about 1.38 billion. They're the two largest, most populous nations in the world. And the question is, what nation or what nation, country is the third largest, most populous country in the world? So if you just, let's take maybe 30 seconds and you just enter your first guess on that or first knowledge on that, no Googling it for the answer, and just put that in the chat, please. Okay, the second one has to do with nuclear energy. And if you'd also put the answer to this one in the chat, I would really appreciate that. That is, which country generates the largest amount of its electricity from nuclear power? So put the country that you think fits that, and we'll cover those as we go through the talk and get the answer to it later on. Okay, so everybody have them in, hopefully. Let's roll. I'm going to go through a lot of things very rapidly, not because I want you to understand any one point that I'm trying to make, but what I want to do is give you an overview of how complex the natural resource situation is in the world, and where things occur and how they occur. So I'm going to start with CO2 emissions because this is high on a lot of people's list. We'll talk about primary energy, both the conventional share and the renewable shares. And then we'll talk about the critical minerals that are needed for some of these alternative energies that we have, like wind, solar, and electrical vehicles. And if we get time, we'll talk about population. So, first of all, why do countries care about their energy consumption? Well, the first thing is that for many countries, they're concerned about the emissions that accompany their use of primary energy. And 3/4 of the greenhouse gas emissions, this energy sector really holds the key, as it says here, to responding to the world's. Okay, ready? Set. But you could hear me. Everybody's answered the questions, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
the questions are still sitting in chat because I didn't have to reboot.
Good. I think Scott was going to grab those. And so this
Yeah.
is what we were going to cover and still will cover, hopefully. And then why do countries care about their energy? You've got 3/4 of greenhouse gas emissions are from the energy sector in each country. This is a chart showing the world CO2 emissions and the various countries that are in it. There's a pretty steady increase for the last 56 years, and it's increased about 3 times over during that period of time. This is by regions. North America is the blue, Europe and Asia Pacific are the big contributors, and you can see that Asia Pacific is a rather huge contributor. If we break out Asia Pacific into the individual countries, that region has increased 12.4 times in that same 56-year period that the whole globe has increased 3 times, and they are obviously a large part of it. China being the bulk of all of it. India is another large contributor, and Japan, they're the 3 large contributors. And so the world energy consumption looks like this, and we've had about 2.34 times increase in world energy consumption in only 56 years. And most of these charts are going to be this 56 years from 1965 to 2021. So a fairly steady increase in that. And if we overlay the emissions on it, recognizing that correlation is not causation. We see that the CO2 emissions pretty well track the increase in energy usage. United States CO2 emissions have decreased over the last 15 years. And the reason for that is that we have substituted for coal in our power plants a lot of natural gas. And that accounts for 2/3 of the decrease in coal consumption. And another third is from the wind energy that we brought on to supply our electricity. So we've really accomplished something that most of the other countries in the world haven't. And China passed us in emissions back in the early part of the 21st century, and they're now double our emissions. World population increased since 1950, and if we compare the 1965 to 2021, the population has increased 2.36 times, and remember the energy consumption increased 2.34 times. So basically, we've got a very good correlation between population chart, which I'm overlaying on the energy consumption chart, and they're pretty good correlation there between growth in people and growth in energy usage. Well, there's another reason why countries care about energy consumption, and that's because when you plot GDP versus energy, you find that historically energy consumption and GDP increase together, that you can't increase your GDP if you don't have the energy to grow. And if you have the energy to grow, you can increase your GDP. So we have energy consumption plotted against GDP, and it's a very straight line up from 1969 to 2013. Okay, the big three. Here's the answer to the first question. The United States is the third most populous country. And I had used in talks that I've given for the last couple of decades, I had used China, India, and the United States to show a lot of impact on the world's situation. And I never realized until last fall that the United States was the third largest country. 40% of the world's population are from just China and India. And China and India together are 8.5 times the population of the United States. There are a lot of people there. And this is 2020 numbers. People said that last week or the week before, I can't remember which, that India actually passed China in population. Okay, so these three countries are quite interesting: United States, China, and India. The land area is interesting because the United States and China are both about the same land area, just slightly over 9 million square kilometers, but India is only about 1/3 the land area of those two countries. So I was kind of surprised to learn that number. The population we've looked at already, and the gross national product is 21.3 for the United States, and China is considerably behind that, but the closest to it, and India is way behind. So in terms of primary energy consumption, the United States is like this, China looks like this. All of these comparison of the three countries are going to be on exactly the same scale. I've squashed them so that they match exactly. So 100 exajoules of primary energy usage is the red dashed line on there. And you can see that China passed us in about 2007 in terms of energy usage. And our primary energy consumption has been fairly flat, which is sort of surprising to me. India is increasing, but is much less than the other two. One of the things that's kind of interesting is if you take, well, these three together have 40% of the world's population, but they consume 48% of the world's energy. if you lay India on top of China, notice that they are right where China was only 25 years ago. So if India gets rolling like China is rolling or got rolling 25 years ago, and they certainly want to do that, the world's going to see a situation that's pretty amazing. And I don't think that they can do the pace that China has, partly because China's a controlled economy and India's a democracy. That's going to cause India to not be able to do the same kinds of things that China has done. Just looking at the GDP versus energy consumption, just to kind of confirm that for each of the three. For the United States, GDP has had a growth rate here, and the energy growth is about the same pattern. So the same pattern holds up. The brown line is GDP growth, the blue is total energy consumption for China, and then India on the left with the same sort of thing, except it's a blue line. So this is the way our world primary energy consumption is divided up. And an important point is that 80% of the primary energy that the world uses comes from fossil fuels. So that alone, if you just acknowledge that, means that trying to do a conversion from energy to alternative energy sources is a real steep hill to climb. And you can see the change in 2021, the new additions of primary energy that we have are all fossil fuels for the big ones. And wind and solar have contributed a bit, but not as much as the fossil fuels, and nuclear even less than wind and solar. And hydropower, we actually lost some energy consumption there, probably because of droughts. So if we look at oil, which is the largest piece of the pie, and almost 30% of the energy pie, world oil consumption has been increasing at a fairly steady rate, except for the drop up there for COVID. But it's probably going to come back to that same growth rate, is my suspicion. These are the regions divided up. North America, 22 million barrels per day. Europe at 14, and Asia Pacific at 36 million. The largest consuming part of the world is Asia Pacific. In terms of production, the Middle East is the largest producer, but they're not a large consumer. They supply much of the rest of the world with oil. North America is second, and the former Soviet Union is third, and the others are kind of minor contributions, Africa and Asia Pacific. So if we look at Asia Pacific at the consumption versus production, 36 million barrels a day that they consume, that they only produce 7 million barrels a day. So the Asia Pacific region is dependent on the rest of the world to supply oil to them. And if we look at the big three oil consumption, the United States has been fairly flat on their consumption. China continues to increase their oil consumption at a fairly rapid and steady pace, and India is increasing at a slower rate than what China is. And 41% of the world oil consumption in 2021 were these three. U.S. oil production was peaked in 1970, and it's been declining in a steady decline down to 2007. In 2007, I spoke at an international oil conference, had some of the top experts in the world there, and I can guarantee you in 2007, the whole talk and the whole concern of the whole world was declining oil production and production going down and getting shortages of it. And we had been declining ever since 1970, except for that little bump in the 80s when Alaska came on. And at the time in 2007, we were importing 2/3 of our oil. But then something unbelievable happened. And I can assure you, the people at that 2007 course seminar had no earthly idea that this was even possible. And that's what US oil production looks like for the rest of the time in the 21st century. So it had a huge increase and far surpassed the 1970 peak, which nobody thought would ever happen. And it was technology that did that. So if we look around for production, we're the top producer in the world right now at 15 million barrels a day, more than Saudi Arabia's 12 million barrels a day. Russia is third. China is fourth, but they have to import 2/3 of their, they're sixth, but they have to import 2/3 of the oil that they use. And India is way down at 10th, and they have to import 85% of the oil that they use. So looking at coal, which is the great evil black monster for most people, world coal consumption has been going up, and it probably will continue to go up. If we look at the big three, we've actually been declining our coal production, as we saw 20% that was caused by substituting natural gas and wind for our coal production. But the big three consume 2/3 of the world's coal. And India is increasing theirs, and they want to increase more. They built some deep water ports to import more. China's there. So when we look at China, China alone consumes 50% of the world's coal. And this little dip here was a time, what I understand is that they were planning to go completely renewables and replace a lot of this coal. And for what they wanted to achieve in terms of their growth in GDP and that sort of thing, that the renewables were not getting it, and they went back to building more coal plants. The number of coal plants that they build and the pace is just mind-boggling. But the interesting thing is that China is the largest user of renewables in the world by far. And we'll see some of that in a couple of more slides down the way. But this was first pointed out to me by one of the real Emery Lovings, who has the Aspen Institute. Pointed this out, and it's very interesting, and it's true. But let's look at this, finish looking at this coal. And this chart is to show you a caution when people use percentages in talking about energy and any other kind of thing. You have to be very cautious about that and look behind those numbers. So here's a chart that says that electricity from coal in China from 2004 to 2019 was reduced from 78% to 62%, 78% to 62%. But if we look at the electricity that was generated over that period of time, 2200 to 7327, electricity increased more than 2.5 times from coal. So it's true that coal as a percentage of the production of electricity reduced in percentage, but it greatly increased in numbers. And if we look here, the part from coal making up, well, the total is in the left column, but this central column is the amount of electricity from coal. And that increased more than 2.5 times, while the percentage of electricity by coal. So you were increasing the electricity generation so much that the coal part of it actually dropped. Natural gas, the world likes natural gas, and it's on a pretty steady increase up there. The big three produce about 45% of the world's natural gas, or consume 45% of natural gas of the world. And the United States has increased their gas consumption because we're switching coal and because we've found more gas and are able to produce more gas. In 2007, we were also worried not just about oil, but about natural gas, because we were having to increasingly import natural gas in order to feed our consumption, even though it was flat during the early 2000s, but we just didn't have internally enough natural gas to do that. So nuclear is kind of interesting, and that was our second question. What's the world's largest producer of nuclear energy? And nuclear energy is very concentrated energy. They're showing here an eraser-sized pellet is equal to a ton of coal, or 3 barrels of oil, or 17,000 cubic feet of natural gas. Very, very concentrated. So it has a lower environmental footprint. You can have a large nuclear facility with a couple of units operating on it that don't take up much land, as opposed to this wind and solar PV large-scale facility in China. So why use nuclear that's the most concentrated? It doesn't have CO2 emissions, it has lower environmental footprint. It's 24/7, whereas wind and solar are not 24/7. And that, as of today, since we don't have storage really solved yet, is a problem. And there's much less mining necessary for nuclear, and we'll see about the mining that is necessary for all alternative energy things. Why not nuclear? Radioactivity scares people, expensive construction, no permanent waste repository, waste transportation concerns, long permitting process, legal roadblocks, and so on. And electricity production from nuclear sources, again, percentages here have dropped from 17 back in 1990 down to 8, but there's still a lot of nuclear energy being produced. So here's the consumption, and this big drop here occurred when the Fukushima problem developed from a tsunami that came in and shut down those reactors, and Japan shut down all of their reactors, and they were very heavily dependent on nuclear. And they've now realized that Fukushima was kind of a freak situation, and geologically we can talk about that afterwards, but basically they have started back up a couple of reactors already and probably are going to bring on more. And this is the United States, and it turns out that the answer to that third question is of interest that we'll look at in a minute. China likes nuclear energy, and they are increasing theirs, and we'll see how wildly they are increasing in a minute. And India is increasing theirs sort of slightly. The United States is the largest nuclear generator of electricity in the world, and it is by far. A lot of people think France, because France is 70% of their electricity comes from nuclear, but they're a small country.
Vince, Scott here. Just to on that point, I tallied the different countries that folks put down for nuclear production, and France, as you just stated, was the overwhelming favorite of the audience.
Right.
Only one person said it was the U.S.
And you see, I didn't know that. When I first saw this chart in 2003, of course, it was farther back, but showing this increase going up, I didn't know that. I looked at that chart and I said, that has got to be wrong. And I checked it in 2 other places. We produce more than double France, and we produce more than anybody else in the world by far. So Japan, I think, was number 2 for a while before they shut all of theirs down. So why don't we know this? I mean, nuclear power has operated in this country safely for a long, long time. I lived near the first nuclear reactor in the 1950s down the river from Pittsburgh. And it has grown ever since, and it's supplied steady, and there have been no accidents here. The thing like Chernobyl was a freak and typical of Russia's lousy management of things. And Fukushima was a freak of geology. So just China and the US alone produce 45% of the world's nuclear energy. Thanks for bringing that up, Scott. So we have 92 nuclear generating units that have operated safely. 3 Mile Island is one that people are all got panicked about, but nobody was even injured by the 3 Mile Island catastrophe, and it was contained. So they're spread all over the country, and those of you who have gray hair like me, living out there in Quimper country, you may remember that Dixie Lee Ray was your governor at one time, and before she was governor, she was head of the Atomic Energy Commission. And she did something very important there. She separated the research and promotion sections of the agency from the safety agency. So the safety part was commissioned with only safety. And I think the record indicates that that was a very, very smart move. And thank you, Dixie Lee Ray. So who's building nuclear reactors today and around the world? And China, of course, as you might guess, is building a lot. India is committed to building a lot more. And the US, well, the US down here has got 2 under construction. And that's interesting because if you tried to permit a nuclear power plant in the United States today, a brand new one that was somewhere, you would never, I mean, the roadblocks that you would get thrown up by regulations and by lawsuits from people who don't want nuclear power would just stop you. It couldn't be done. The reason that these 2 reactors can be built is because they are at an existing nuclear facility, and it's on the land that is already being used for a couple of nuclear reactors. So the permitting process was much less, and people didn't really get opposition built up to it to object to it. And Japan is starting to come back with a couple of more reactors. So our share of total US energy is split amongst these different end users. Transportation is a large one, and industrial is the largest. Residential is 3rd largest, and commercial is 18%. So world electricity consumption, that's something that we talk about now. And it's important to remember that electricity is not primary energy. You didn't see that on that pie chart because electricity is only a carrier of energy. So what you do is take primary energy and generate electricity, and it's transmitted through cables to places where it can be used. And a steady increase in world electricity consumption. Electricity from fossil fuels, for percentage line wise, these lines only go between 61 and 68%, so it's a little bit exaggerated chart, but we were down in 95 at 61%, and we reached a little over 67% in about 2008. This is where the electricity is generated from these primary energy sources, and coal, as you can see, is the largest generator of electricity in the world. And natural gas is second, and then we go down to other being 5%. One of the problems that we have is that when we convert this primary energy, whatever it is, whether it's solar or coal, we lose a lot of that energy in converting it into electricity. And it's about 70% for all of them. It's about 70% for the thermal loss in coal, and it's about 70% loss in solar, which surprised me. So we start with these primary energy sources, and as we go to the energy carrier, which is electricity is an energy carrier, we lose that 70% of the primary energy. And then if we look at this end use stuff here, as we transport the electricity to the people who are going to use it on the end, we lose more. So if you look at the people, I mean, these losses here that you see on this chart, the purchased electricity is the brown. That's what people actually buy and pay for. But look at the green, the electrical system losses. It's much larger than the electricity that gets to the end user. So we lose a lot through electrical transmission. And so when we have a certain requirement for our energy on the user end, we've got to use a lot more primary image energy to get the energy that we need where we need it. And there's a problem with people who have access to electricity across the world. There are about 930 million people who do not have access to electricity in the world, and they're concentrated in these colored areas. Most of it in Africa, but some of it in parts of Asia, and also Central America has one. And I would really recommend this video to everybody. It's a very powerful and very poignant video. Switch on, it's made by Scott Tinker in Texas, and it talks about the people who are in energy poverty. And it also talks about people in their clean fuels for cooking. And that's a real issue in many parts of the world. And that video just very poignantly covers this topic and the kids that are dying of people cooking dung and wood in an open fireplace in their homes. So nuclear energy, renewable energy has got everybody really excited about getting off of coal and getting off of wood and all that sort of thing. And so it's in the news all the time. New York taking a big step toward renewable energy. These are all just from the very recent articles that are in there. So you can hardly pick up anything and not see an article on renewable energy. And so the world is increasing its consumption of nuclear energy, and on a fairly steep curve. And the big three, renewables capacity, China, United States, and India is the orange line down there. China and the United States have increased their consumption, and the blue is world. So the big three produce 53% of the world renewables capacity. And you can see how much bigger that yellow wedge is of China. And remember that they only have 40% of the world's population. So the big three are really the drivers of renewables. And this kind of shows that a little bit better. This is China in the turquoise compared to the other parts of the world. And you can see that they are really outdoing the rest of the world. And this chart right here is the percentage of the new additions of renewable energy each year. And you can see that in 2020, China was 50% of the renewables that were added in the world that year. They truly are the leader in renewables and 5 or 6 renewable alternative energies. So the US is down here in blue, and we're nowhere near what China is doing. And Europe is in this pale green. When we look at the technology of the renewable energies, we have solar photovoltaic panels are the largest of them all, and they're increasing for the last 4 years. Wind is actually not increasing for the last few years because there's been opposition develop in the United States to more wind. People are getting real goosey about permitting it. Some governments are actually passing laws that say no wind developments. If you drive around my area here in Wisconsin to the farmland out there, you'll see no wind turbine signs all over the place. And hydro is a small addition, and of course some others. So here we see wind and solar. And it's interesting that for the world here, the additions of wind, which are shown in blue, were outpacing solar for a long time. But in 2021, solar outpaced wind. And that's a real interesting development. And the reason I'm giving you 2021 rather than 2022 is that at the end of the year, it takes you a long time to gather all this data and put it together. So the results for 2022 won't be done until late June. And that's when we'll get the additions of that sort of thing. The world's solar and wind look like this. Just a different way of showing the bar charts. But they total 1.6 terawatts of electricity of capacity. Now, they don't generate 1.6 terawatts. This is the nameplate capacity of it, and we all know that they're not 24/7. But we can use that for comparison. So up to 2007, the increase in world's solar and wind looked like this. And since 1985, the world had doubled. Okay, let me back up. This chart that I'm showing is of total electricity generation in the world, renewables and fossil fuels and anything else, nuclear. So we doubled by 2007 our consumption of electricity in the world. So in 1985, we were here, and we've increased it that much. As we go on, we had a pretty steady increase, as we've seen before, worldwide. If we just look at since 2010, and 2010 was about the time that wind and solar really started cranking up. So during the time that wind and solar have been cranking up, electricity usage has increased this much, which if we put it down here, it is 6.6 terawatts of increase in electricity consumption for the world. And when we put that 1.6 terawatts of wind and solar, the mountain that we've got to climb if we're going to convert entirely to solar and wind. And they are a small part here, 5% of total electrical capacity and only 2.5% of the world's primary energy. So let's look at some of the minerals that are necessary for these critical minerals in alternative energies. If we have solar, we need all of these elements to make the solar panels and to create solar electricity from solar PV. If we do electric vehicles, we need some different minerals and elements that go into making our electric vehicles. And wind requires this. The rare earths are common to both electrical vehicles and wind. Molybdenum is common to both solar and wind, and silver is common to both electric vehicles and solar. So right in the middle is copper, which is crucial to all of them. So let's take a look at some of this. Here's our percentage, United States percentage of copper through time. We started out producing about 35% of the world's copper, and it is reduced down now to about 10% of the world's copper. And the top producing countries of copper are Chile, Peru, China, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the US. And we have to import 45% of the copper that we use, even though we're in the top 5. In fact, speaking of importing, of 65 mineral commodities that we have to, these are the imports that the U.S. Geological Survey puts together each year. And what this tells us is 3/4 of these 65 mineral commodities, we have to import more than 50%. And 1/4 of them, we have to import 100%. So we are very dependent on these mineral imports. And they've been getting worse with time. If we look at the 100% bars from the 60 years from 1954 to 2014, we see that we've grown from 8 to 19 mineral commodities that we have to import over 100. And the 50 to 100 to less than 100, we have to increase. We have increased from 20 to 28, and the 25 to 50%, we've had to go from 5 to 11. So we've been increasing this. Part of this because we've used up a lot of the stuff that we have here in the United States, but a big part of it is it's very difficult to permit a new mine and get it online. And this is where we are importing those minerals from. And China is the biggest place that we get those commodities from. And Russia is another large exporter to us. Okay, so we look at the big 3 solar capacity, China, United States. We have this relative to the world. We have 53% of the world's solar capacity. And the annual additions by country, you can see that China, again, is by far the biggest adder of solar. And one of the things that is interesting to look at, Europe is probably second in terms of the volume of addition of solar. United States is third, and then India. And this black line shows the percentage of distributed solar PV. In other words, the rooftop things on houses and apartment houses and things like that, as opposed to the big utility scale solar ones that I showed the picture of earlier. So they are actually putting out more from the utility scale than they are from the distributed. And most folks that look at this think distributed is really the answer. And so you look at Europe's right next door, you see that they're a much higher percentage of distributed than China is. Okay, so much for solar. Let's look at wind. Here's the world wind capacity. And you notice that there's a kink there at about 2018 where the slope steepened. So the world was adding a lot more wind at that point. And here's the breakout with the big 3 again. China again is the big kahuna, and the United States is second, and India is there in the orange, and the world, the rest of the, well, that's the total world in blue. And the big 3 contribute 56% of the world wind energy. And again, just remind you that 40% is their population. So they are disproportionate, and most of that's because of China. And again, looking at it on a bar chart rather than the area chart. China is the purple, and they are way ahead of Europe in the orange and the US in yellow. And China added 40% of the world's wind capacity in 2021 and 40% more than all of Europe added in 2021. And 2.5 times our wind capacity. Okay, so let's take a look at wind and what's needed to build these huge machines. This is a typical wind turbine. It uses 22.5 tons of copper for each one of those turbines. That's a lot of copper. Now, if you look at the average grade of copper that through time, it's been getting less and less. And it's gone from about 2.4% to down to right now, the big copper porphyries in the world have about 0.03%. 0.3%, not 1% copper of the rock, but 0.3, a third of 1% of the rock is actually copper. So to get that 22.4 tons of copper for the one wind turbine, you've got to mine 5,600 tons of rock of ore to get that copper needed for one wind turbine. That's moving a lot of territory. That's the equivalent of that tons, if you put it in pounds, it's 11.2 million pounds. These are where copper mines are located in the United States, most of them in Arizona, the big ones. And when I say big, I mean big. This is the Morenci mine, and I was taking a trip with my dogs along I just wanted to drive up this road that went along the border of Arizona and New Mexico, and I'd never heard of Morenci. I didn't know anything about Morenci. I was just interested in seeing what was on this road. And I came on this, and the road goes right through this, and I could not believe my eyes. This is an open pit. If you look from here to there, just to give you a little idea of the scale, that's 5 miles across those pits. It is huge. So you got to move a lot of rock to get the copper that we need. And our production has been decreasing a bit lately, and the value of the production has actually gone up. Well, how is the value gone up when the production's going down? It's because the price of copper is going up. And here's the price of copper, gone from 75 cents a pound to $4.70 a pound. If you're a business person trying to operate with those kinds of swings in price, it's a nightmare to do any kind of planning for your business, no matter what kind of business it is. So China in 2007, they said that their goal was to generate 80 gigawatts of wind by 2020. And China has these 5-year plans that Chairman Mao started back in the 50s when he was converting China. And they tend to meet their 5-year plans. And so that would require 597,000 tons of copper. And you can multiply that times the other number to see how much rock you'd have to move to get that. And they did pretty well. Excuse me, I'm sorry. This is the United States said they wanted to do 80 gigawatts, and just save all those things I said for when we get to the China chart. So we increased our capacity, and we actually achieved 132 gigawatts by that date rather than 80. So we did pretty well. China, on the other hand, said that they would increase 330 gigawatts by 2020 instead of our 80. And they only achieved 329, and they did it a year later. But that's pretty darn good forecasting and achieving. And that used this many tons of copper. So you use a lot more copper when you go offshore. I know people are looking at, let's put these wind deals offshore, and of course, then you see the whales coming onshore on the East Coast, and you say, is that related to all the construction activity for the wind turbines offshore and the low frequency sounds that come from the wind turbines? At any rate, you got to use more copper in the wind turbines than you do in a gas plant that would use that would give you the same amount of energy, and the gas plant would give it to you 24/7. Okay, so that copper is not the only thing in wind turbines. You use a lot of steel, you use fiberglass resin or plastic. And the interesting thing is fiberglass resin or plastic is what? It's petroleum products, fossil fuel. A lot of iron. The copper is only actually 1% of the whole deal, and aluminum, depending on the manufacturer, uses 0 to 2%. Copper production, you see. Okay, copper in terms of our imports, there's our 45%, and we get most of it from Chile, Canada, or Mexico. Okay, 12.4% of our world primary energy consumption is from renewables, and wind and solar make up 2.5% of that. Biomass is 2/3 of that world's renewable energy. 2/3 of the 12.5% renewables that we have today are biomass. And hydro is in there. And when we look at the makeup in the United States of our renewable energy, we find that biomass is 40%, not as much as the world's, but 40% of what we call renewables. So when people tell you about renewables, you know, they're not talking about solar and wind alone. They're talking about a lot of other things, and a lot of that stuff is not necessarily good kind of stuff. So, at any rate, to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, this is a study that the International Energy Agency did they finished it last year. Okay. Basically, I'm going to skip this because I got another chart that shows that. Okay, somehow I didn't get something in here. So rare earths. Well, somehow we got things goofed up at the bottom. Okay, so rare earths, we have to import about greater than 95%. And these are some of the wonderful names of these elements that are rare earths. They're not particularly rare, but neodymium, praseodymium, and all this. These are really crucial in turbines and engines for vehicles. And the rare earths, this vehicle here, the Prius, was called once the biggest user of rare earths because they go into all of these sorts of things here. And we used to be the world's largest producer of rare earths back in the 1970s. And then China decided that they could become the Middle East of rare earths, and they started flooding the market with cheap rare earths and drove the United States and other people pretty much out of business. And so US for a long time didn't produce any rare earths. And the largest mine for those was in California at a place called Mountain Pass. And China controlled 97% of the market back in about 2010. So China still is the largest producer of rare earths, but their reserves are important. They have the largest reserves of rare earths in the world. So they're going to be the source for a lot of countries for a long time. Other countries have, Vietnam has low production right now, but they have large reserves of rare earths. And one country that isn't on here is Afghanistan. They have huge rare earth reserves. Russia has large reserves also and produces a fair amount. And Brazil doesn't produce that much, but they do have large reserves. The United States is one of the larger producers today in 2020, and they're going to produce more in 2021, according to this. And they do have not that many reserves. So we import our rare earths from China now, 78%, and we get them from these other countries. 60% of the global rare earth mined production. Lots of countries have tried to get away from China because they were playing dirty with their rare earths, jacking up the price, cutting back production. Okay, electric vehicles. We have this new idea of electric vehicles, not so new. China has, in 2022, the largest sales of vehicles in the world. And it's the 8th year in a row that they've been the leader in the world of selling electric vehicles. And the reason is that back in the early part of the 21st century, they wanted to get control of the car market, and they knew that they couldn't beat Japan easily and the US. So they saw electric vehicles as the future, and they concentrated on manufacturing electrical vehicles. And that was a pretty smart move on their part. There's a lot more copper in a conventional car, in an electric car than there is in a conventional car. So let's take a quick look at what's happening here. We have a BEV, a battery electric vehicle, and it is connected to a charging station. Now, the charging station doesn't have any electricity. It doesn't generate any energy or electricity there. It's only an outlet. It's like an outlet in your house. You plug the thing into the wall, and it's connected to wires that bring electricity to you. The ideal situation here is that the solar panels will be right near this charging station, and all the electricity can come from the solar panels. That's kind of the ideal situation, but it's not the situation yet today. So, and what is happening here is that this charging station is putting electricity into the car, which is pushing lithium from the cathode of the battery to its anode, or it's charging the battery. And let's just look at that because minerals are needed for all of this. So on the cathode, you have lithium in the dark, small, kind of turquoisey colors. And what the charger is doing is the electricity is pushing the lithium over to the anode. And the anode is where the lithium is stored until it is discharged as electricity to the motor. So the lithium is just moving back and forth between the cathode and the anode. It moves to the anode, the electricity from the charging station pushes it over there. And then when you use it to run your vehicle, it moves over to the cathode and generates electricity to run that. And these are critical minerals, and lithium's in the paper all the time now. We have to import a little over 25% of our lithium. And the price has been soaring from $3 a pound to $38 a pound. And so demand does that. It's dropped back right now. So we're really happy it's only 4 times what it was rather than 10 times what it was. Okay, so the other thing that we find in the anode is graphite, the gray. And graphite is what the lithium moves to. It attracts it when you're setting it. Graphite we have, or there's some graphite in Madagascar. Madagascar is notable for artisan mining, they call it. And using kids like this, Tavita on the left is 14 and Roland on the right is 17. And you notice their safety equipment they're wearing. And they go into places like this, and they're on, Madagascar is mineral rich. This is not a graphite mine, but it's typical of the type of mining that goes on there. The graphite price has gone up again and doubled. We got to import 100% of it, although we do have some graphite here and people are looking at trying to do it. Then the cathode also has metal. We discharged the lithium is attracted to that metal, and that can be cobalt, nickel, or manganese, and or a combination of them. This is what
Excuse me, Vince.
Yes.
Vince, Scott here. We're about at 1 hour since you actually started the talk, taking into account the technical difficulties at the start. So if you can think about wrapping up here pretty soon, that'd be great.
You bet. Okay, so they call it blood cobalt. You have children and people with no safety equipment mining an awful lot of this stuff in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So we're getting stuff from there. So cobalt price has gone up. See lots of prices going up in materials. Here's the world's first all-electric cement mixer. And look at China. China produces 2/3 of the world's cement. That's just the International Energy Agency. They have, they developed 3 scenarios, and a lot of people do projections and models of what's going to happen in the world. The International Energy Agency didn't make a model like this. They took what people said they were going to do, and they took and calculated what the minerals are that are going to be needed for that. So the first one was the Sustainable Development Scenario, which was the 2016 Paris Agreement. People agreed to do a certain number of things, and the signers to that agreed to this. Then they did another scenario, which is kind of the same thing, but if all the people who didn't sign the Paris Agreement, like China, suddenly said, hey, we want to achieve those goals, and what would be the minerals to achieve that if we did this net zero globally? And then they have what the stated policies are right now of each country, and they figured all those in the investments that were needed for that. So to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, you needed to produce 4 times the minerals that you produce right now, or you produced in 2020. 4 times. If you're going to do the net zero by 2050, you need to mine 6 times more each year minerals up to 2040 than today's requirements. And then if you look at the stated policies where people said it, they said the government's policies don't add up to the Paris goals. So these are just documentations of that. Very important sign. I'm not Vince, the sign guy. I wish I was, because I think he's extremely bright and clever. So I'll just close with this, which was the picture that I opened with, which was kind of faded out there. My wife and I drove back from my 62nd high school reunion in Pittsburgh last August. And we drove through Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. And that just drove home what's going on in this country. What we saw was soybean field, cornfield, soybean field, cornfield, soybean field, cornfield, soybeans in the foreground here. I had to stop and take a picture of it. It was so mind-boggling. Mile after mile after mile for as far as you could see. And this is all for this ethanol stuff. And it has been 3 states have published documentation of how harmful this is for the environment. They now know that the CO2 for the full cycle stuff for ethanol is not a good idea. And this is one of the worst things that I think the government has ever done, is to subsidize this stuff. But it's not going to change because it's jobs in the Midwest, and it is big ag. So at any rate, let's call that a quit.
Thank you, Vince. Interesting talk, packed with information and a lot of stuff that I didn't know. I'm sure that's true for much of the audience. We have several questions here in the chat room,
Okay.
as well as comments. I think what I'll do is I'll focus on the questions. And if we have time at the end, I can read off some of the comments, or you can do it on your own.
So if Vince stops his screen share, we can see him. Thank you. There you are.
Oh, nice picture. So anyways, David Minger asked the question, how much of the cost of new nuclear in the US is self-inflicted through regulatory demands, environmental studies, and other permitting? All can be important to do, but can be overdone. And a kind of a related question that he asked, what's the connection or dissonance between China doing great on renewables, but also building a new coal plant at almost every week?
Well, the dissonance is China wants to grow their economy. And as we saw in the charts, to grow an economy, you've got to have energy. And so they know that they can't do it with renewables alone, but they really, I think, made a valiant effort toward doing it, and still making valiant efforts. Certainly nobody else in the world is coming close to the renewables that they've done, but they just can't do it. They have to use, they're trying to bring in nuclear, and if they get all those nuclear plants built, they can take a lot of coal plants offline because they've got 24/7 there. But that's a major problem, that intermittent supply of wind and solar. And I just don't know how we're going to do it all with wind and solar. I don't see a possibility there. Wind and solar can be an important component, but it's tough. The first question I'd forgotten about the regulation and all that. I don't have any data on that question.
There was another question and a comment about the copper used in wind turbines. Where is all that copper going? Is it in wiring? Is it in the motor? Wires in the motor?
It's in both. The wire, it's probably, I think it's about half and half in wiring and cabling. The turbine, of course, in order to generate electricity, you spin that call it a propeller, not being able to.
Yeah.
The propeller spins and it turns a generator in there, and that generator is wound copper around, and that passes through a magnetic field. And that's where you need the neodymium and the praseodymium, because those make extremely strong magnets. And the praseodymium also is a high temperature. It operates, the magnetism stays at high temperatures. So the heat that's generated from the turning, which is some of the loss that you get when you convert that, doesn't take away the magnetism of the praseodymium. So the turbine, I think, is like maybe 10 tons and 10 tons in the copper cabling.
One quick further question on wind turbines that I have is, you had mentioned in the US and perhaps elsewhere, there's kind of a recent kind of dissatisfaction with wind turbines or some issues. Are you referring to like bird deaths from flying into the vortex, or is it noise, or what exactly is
Well, I
the?
think different people have different issues. I know people who are concerned about birds. I'm concerned about birds, and there are endangered species that are done. And there actually was a company recently who was fined for a wind turbine company was fined for killing endangered species with their wind turbines. But the total number, I mean, the total number of birds that are killed there is a fairly high number, but it's nowhere near the number killed by cats every year. So you have, when you say there's X number of birds killed by wind turbines and you don't put it into perspective of what's really reducing the number of them, then you're going to oppose it because you don't want birds killed. And so there's a lot of that sort of thing going on. Increasingly, people are finding that these low vibrations they're claiming that they're causing them not to be able to sleep, that there are other health effects that may be associated with them. So there's opposition from that standpoint. A lot of people don't like the view shed with all of these wind turbines going up in places that are kind of natural. I can remember standing in Guadalupe National Park and looking out and seeing all these wind turbines on the skyline. And to me, it didn't belong looking from a national park out on this big, huge wind farm in West Texas. So, but other people say, oh, that's beautiful, those wind turbines out there. So it's all a variety of things, I think, that people are objecting to.
Ray Kamada asked, given that they don't rely on a Carnot process, what counts as energy loss via electricity for renewables? And then Tom also commented, Carnot efficiency is about 32% for modern supercritical coal-fired plants, but is about 64% for CCGTs. I don't know if that makes sense. Maybe
it makes sense, although I don't understand all of it. And I think that those numbers came from the International Energy Agency's 2022 report, in which they talked about the losses with that. And so I mentioned the heat. When that turbine gets turning, that spinning it around, there's a lot of heat that's generated. That's lost energy. And of course, you're losing a lot of energy in the transmission lines. But I'm not knowledgeable enough to go beyond that.
Pat Pringle asks, so where do you see blue sky? Question mark.
Blue sky. Where do I get hope?
Yeah, I think
Yeah,
that.
see my previous question, a couple up, my previous summary of what I think are Vince's big ideas here, and just say, are those big ideas close to what he's trying to say? And the blue sky, I mean, where do you see hope? Where do you see a path forward?
Okay, just looking at it cold, I would say, I've said it in a couple of different ways. It's a cliff to climb. It's a mountain to climb. Converting that much energy to wind and solar, I don't see it. Nuclear, I think, has to play, if we're going to do it, nuclear has to play a huge role. And that's going to be very hard in this country. Getting a mine permitted in this country is almost impossible unless you live in Nevada. And if you're on federal land in Nevada, then it's also difficult. The feds just shut down a geothermal power plant in Nevada. I mean, that's one of our renewable sources. And Nevada is a great place for generating geothermal power. They have lots of places there that they've done it safely, and the feds shut it down. So it's a very tough climb. I'll tell you what gives me hope is oil. That increase in US oil production was all through technology. So if we could have a breakthrough in renewables like or conservation or whatever, and there are lots of places to have those. And of course, Scott Tinker, whose video I recommended, likes to say the cheapest energy that we have is the watt that we don't use. And there's lots we can do in conservation. But if we can have a breakthrough on the magnitude of what happened in oil and gas production in the United States in some other energy area that's clean, we could really, that would be the wish. And that breakthrough that we did make in oil and gas that nobody foresaw, nobody could in their wildest imagination ever suspect that we would have achieved the level of oil and gas production that we have achieved using that technology. I just hope that that's going to help us somewhere along the line quickly, hopefully. But because we didn't know it in oil and gas, we don't know where it's going to come from.
Judy Romano asked, is it still a good idea to buy an EV given the minerals and commodities that go into making them?
I don't give advice like that.
Yeah. And kind of related question, David Minger said, what's the cost of electricity going to be to recharge the batteries? How often do you need a new battery? So on.
I think that's an excellent question, and it's one that if I were thinking about an EV, I'd want to think about that long and hard.
Okay, well, I think that kind of covers the questions. There's a lot of comments that related to various topics you covered in the talk, which we can capture and send to you if you'd like, or unless you want to go through more of them now. We're at about an hour and a half after we started.
Yeah.
So we probably
If you could
wrap
just send them to me, that would be great. I would be glad to stay, but I know people would like to get on about their Saturday evening.
Well, thank you very much, Vince. Excellent talk. Very thorough coverage of the subjects. Appreciate you talking to us from far away in Wisconsin, where it's 2 hours later than Port Townsend. Much appreciated. Thank you very much.
Scott, thank you. I will just say that I got the time change wrong at first. And I thought I was supposed to start at 2 rather than at 6.
Oh, no. Glad you figured that one out, Vince.
You know what? I'm glad that you mentioned I was to get on at 5:30 in your email. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you, everyone in the audience for attending today. And we look forward to seeing you all at the next talk in the fall.